Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. As always, we are so glad to have you with us. We've got the third week of the college football playoff rankings to discuss. There's a lot of issues that seem to be coming up every week, which they should. And we've also got some of the biggest and interesting games coming up here in week 13. Lucky 13. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Sean, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yeah, we're getting to the last little bit. There's a huge matchup this weekend between Ohio State and Indy freaking Anna. It's an exciting time to be a college football fan.
It is, and it was so funny kind of going down the list. So many of these games could have an impact kind of in the macro level, but also in some of these eventual conference tiebreakers, because inevitably one of these conferences, especially looking at the Big 12 and SEC, are probably heading into some sort of weird tiebreaking to get into their conference title games and perhaps ultimately into those at-large spots. But before we dive into that area, so the third rankings came out. We've talked about that. Once again, fairly similar to ours. I think. And it's interesting. I thought about it. So the difference between the CFP rankings and our rankings is on our Survivor Island, we make sure to include 5 conference champions. So usually the P4 plus the G5 champ, which has been Boise State for the recent history. They don't have to do that in the normal CFP rankings because they don't care where you don't have to be in the final 12. You just have to be somewhere. They'll pick you out, to fill in the 5 highest ranked teams. So they went Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, Indiana. Nothing really changed there. Of course, with the BYU loss, we saw Notre Dame jump up. We have Alabama, Miami, Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee, and then Boise State came back into the top 12. They had fallen out in the previous week. And of course, for us, we don't have Ole Miss and Tennessee, but we have SMU and BYU to have members of the ACC and Big 12. But all of that said, it was an interesting thing to see. I mean, there were a lot of takeaways out of this and just how things have changed. I mean, I'll just say, just to kind of start out, I think maybe the biggest takeaway is the rest of the country is realizing what so many of us who were kind of analyzing the way the 12-team playoff and the seeding was going to go, we are actually in a situation where Boise State, if they went final now, would be the 4th seed. And the Big 12 would be the team that would be potentially the 12 seed or higher, depending on where they finish. I mean, that to me is still, it's so funny. I think folks like us who've been talking about it a lot, and I mean, obviously a lot of folks in the media and some of the more, astute college football fans throughout, all the places that they congregate. But for a lot of casual fans, this must have absolutely been a shock. Like, they're wondering, how good is Ashton Jeanty? They're like, where did this team come from? But I mean, I just want to take a moment and realize that this is something that, at least for this moment, we get to observe.
Yeah, and look, I think that for them to be number 12 is totally deserved, right? They absolutely should be in contention for the first round bye. Their only loss to this point, of course, a 3-point loss at the buzzer against Oregon, who's the number 1 team in the country. They played Oregon closer than anybody, and that includes Ohio State, by the way. And they've been really, really good outside of that. Like I've kind of talked about, I feel like for them, it's just make it to the Mountain West title game, win the Mountain West, and kind of let it lie from there. I don't think style points matter too much at this point. Now, I will say, my issue definitely is not with Boise State being in the buys. I think that's totally fair and fine. I don't understand what the committee sees in Miami, where they're sitting up there at number 8, where SMU is 13, and then BYU is 14. I knew that BYU would fall after losing to Kansas, as they should. They fell 8 full spots. They fell behind a team that they beat head-to-head. And the committee, of course, you're able to not only go off of head-to-head. I think that's important, right? Texas lost to Georgia. They're still 7 spots ahead of Georgia. That's fine. But it's confusing to me that two teams that played each other directly would be right next to each other in the rankings at 13 and 14, and the team that lost would be ahead of them, while another team who has a worse resume than both of them, in my mind, is at number 8. Like, I just don't really get it. I felt like we were in a position where the rankings were doing pretty well and where they made a lot of sense. I don't really get the logic of all of this.
Yeah, I agree with you. Especially the SMU thing, that just seeing them ahead of BYU, and it's not like BYU hasn't played anyone. Obviously, SMU's on that list, but they've played a. Part of the problem is, again, the Big 12 has been a bit of it's been what we feared. It's turned into the complete bloodbath towards the end, and Kansas could very well continue that if they pull an upset this weekend with Colorado. But it's fascinating to see the disrespect for the Big 12 in general, because obviously BYU is the highest ranked team at number 14. Colorado's at 16, and we have to acknowledge Arizona State is now in all of this at number 21, and they play BYU this weekend. The game we'll probably talk about certainly in the second half of the show. But it the Miami thing is part of it, and we've talked about this before. How much of it is the value of the logo on the side of the helmet, and based on who they play, and even I think poll inertia, because, and I don't necessarily want to totally get into because SEC is another side of this that I want us to get into. But even, we'll get into that, I think, a bit when we talk about comparing Texas against some of these other SEC teams. And based on who they've played, where do they deserve to even be ranked? And how much of that goes into it as well. I do wonder if this is a blip. And that's why I said, in terms of the Boise State ranking and being where they are, because that's why I said, let's enjoy this moment. I think there is still a possibility that whoever wins the Big 12 will get past Boise State. I think it's quite possible, unless we get a real chaos scenario, which at this rate is quite plausible. But I don't know. I think they'll end up playing. Now, to the credit of maybe they were trying to come up with a way to make up for the fact that Wazoo plummeted out after their bad loss this past weekend to New Mexico. But they put UNLV back in the rankings, which again benefits Boise State, because that's one of that. Now Boise State still has a second ranked win. Although they may not play again, because if all the Mountain West favorites win out, it would end up being Colorado State, which is undefeated in the Mountain West, but has played neither team, would be their challenger in the Mountain West title game. So there's kind of a fascinating situation there. And funny enough, if it ends up being an unranked Colorado State team that has 3 losses, or is it 2 losses? I know they lost to Colorado, and lost to Texas and Oregon State. I think Oregon State pulled one on them. That's why. So they've got like that awkward loss.
They're 7-3 right now.
Yeah, so they're 7-3. They have 2 good losses and 1 really bad loss, because Oregon State's completely falling off the wagon right now. All of that said, that could end up giving the Mountain West kind of an awkward spot. I think Boise State would still get in as a G5, but they may lose their position, I think, as that 4 seed if you get, let's say you end up with Colorado versus BYU. If those 2 teams keep winning, or Arizona State keeps winning, we're going to end up with a pretty good Big 12 title game match that should catapult one of those teams. I think, I'm not saying into necessarily the teen, probably into the single digits, but high enough that they might pass Boise State.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the semi-nightmare scenario for the Big 12 is Arizona State is the team that comes up from behind. And actually, the real nightmare scenario for the Big 12 is this weekend when Army plays against Notre Dame.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you think that's a nightmare, they've got a Nightmare on Elm Street situation that could potentially erupt over there. Yeah, Notre Dame is a whole other kettle of fish. I mean, they really are. And again, we're obviously going to be talking about that Army game in the latter half of the show, but they are the ones that are one of the teams skating on thin ice. Maybe Texas is as well. In fact, those 2 are probably similar in that they really can't afford another loss. Texas could probably afford one in the SEC title game, but Notre Dame doesn't have one. So just as far as the regular season is concerned, 1 loss is the best they can probably hope for, because their schedule, again, not the fault of either team. Michigan ended up being weak, so Texas's win was kind of meaningless in retrospect, at least in terms of the value of strength of schedule. And Florida State disappointed so many teams, and clearly the Irish are one of them. Louisville too. I mean, they're not doing as well. My goodness. So my thoughts to you are, talking back to the strength of schedule thing, there's a couple of these matchups that have been discussed, I've heard. You have the Texas versus Georgia as a classic one, because Georgia absolutely pants Texas in the only truly challenging opponent that the Longhorns have had so far. Penn State and Indiana. Of course, at this point, I think we can set that one aside because they're back to back with each other. But if Indiana loses one to Ohio State, that'll be very fascinating to see. SMU versus Miami, we've talked about. BYU versus everybody, it feels like. Which of these strength of schedule conversations has also affected you that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I think that Notre Dame is an interesting one because like they are just kind of, I feel like they're floating under the radar with how kind of average their schedules become. Like Texas A&M is a good win. They went on the road. They got it. Let's just say though, hypothetically, that Texas wins against Texas A&M next week. Let's say that it's pretty dominant. I mean, this could be a team that could fall out of the rankings, right? Like that's definitely on the table. This Army game is going to be really interesting. And like you said, we'll talk about the details more in the latter half of the show. But if that happens, let's say that Army again loses pretty badly. Like this is a team that also is at risk of falling out of the full top 25. So if you're Notre Dame, like you've played a lot of teams that are top 40-ish, right? Texas A&M, Louisville, Navy, Army, USC will be kind of on the edge of that range. But like you don't really have a whole lot to sell right now, if you're being quite honest. And I think, look, if Notre Dame is a one-loss team, if they win out, I think that they're probably safe. They are likely a team, especially without the conference championship component, that needed to put up some style points. And to their credit, in the latter half of the season, they've done it. 52-3 against Florida State, 35-14 against Virginia, 51-14 against Navy, 31-13 against Georgia Tech. Like they have showed up and obliterated some of these bad to medium teams. But like, I don't know. I'm just really curious how this is going to be evaluated.
I mean, it's also interesting to think how Texas A&M may or may not be the strong opponent that the strong victory that they hope by the end of it all, because obviously it's striking. We'll probably briefly touch on this. They are not favored by much at Auburn. They're favored by like 2.5 at this point. We had that wonderful kind of flub with Mike Elko saying that we are totally, we're totally focused on Auburn,
Yep.
Totally not a trap game. Totally not a trap game
I will ask this. Okay. So one of the metrics that historically is very correlated with how the committee views things is ESPN's strength of record. And so I'm curious, where do you think that Notre Dame ranks in strength of record
right now?
Yes.
Gosh, with that schedule, I have to imagine there's somewhere in like the mid 40s.
Oh, so this isn't strength of schedule. This is the one that takes into account also how you performed against your schedule. So, like for example, Oregon is 1, Georgia is 2, because it's not just who they've played, but it's also how they've performed against the teams that they've played.
Well, they have been fairly decisive. I'll give them that credit. So I could see them being in the top 25 at the very least.
Yes, so they are 13. And just for some comparison, you actually have Ole Miss at 12, Texas A&M at 11, Miami's at 9, BYU is at 8, Indiana's at 6. So this is a metric, again, that takes into account the schedule that you've played, the level of power that you've showed against it, and also takes into account your record within all of this. And this metric is like, no, Notre Dame is so 13. They're at 13. SMU's 14. Boise State's 15. So like that metric views Notre Dame as being in the Boise State tier, and they view Indiana, BYU, Miami as being noticeably above them, which is just to me like a really interesting dynamic.
Especially Miami in that one is to me the aberration. I can make sense of the others in terms of just simply dominating your opponent with a weaker schedule, for example, with Indiana, and which is what you'd want to see from a good team. Consistently just dominating the opponents, and then maybe having a closer one with a team that's a little more to your level. But that is fascinating. Speaking of, it's so funny. For a hot minute, I was thinking Miami of Ohio only because we were talking about Notre Dame opponents who beat NIU this past week, a couple of days ago. So I thought that was funny. We literally watched two of Notre Dame's opponents go against each other, and NIU embarrassed itself again once more to help affect that Notre Dame strength of schedule argument. My goodness, looking again at this, do we think what kind of win do we think Indiana is going to need to stay in this relevant conversation, or what kind of, I should say, win would be an obvious one, but if they lose, will they get overly penalized against like a Penn State? Let's say they lose by, I think they're favored. I think, pardon me, Ohio State's favored by at least 2 scores.
It's 12 last I checked.
Yeah. So 2 scores. Let's say they lose by 2, or maybe just even close to maybe 3. Do we think they're going to be overly punished for that? I mean, versus a Penn State who lost at home to Ohio State, versus an Indiana that had to go and play a very, very, very hyper game day crowd, Ohio State.
Well, and the other thing that I'll mention is that we are in this scenario right now where we're looking at the Ohio State Penn State game and we're like, it was 20-13. It was only a 1-score game. Yeah, one of those was a pick 6. They scored 0 offensive touchdowns in that game. Like, it was not a close game. I want to be clear about that before we start making the comparison. I think that what they need is, one, they need to prove that they belong on the field with Ohio State, that it was a competitive game, that they had a chance to win the game. Now, look, Ohio State maybe can score a late touchdown. I think about that Georgia-Tennessee game. Georgia was always going to beat Tennessee, especially once it got into the second half. It wasn't a 2-touchdown game in terms of Tennessee quality. Georgia scored a late touchdown to put it away. That's the kind of performance that I think that Indiana needs to not get penalized too much. Because look, heading into this game right now, I mean, the reality is, and we can quibble a little bit with how we calculate these things, but Indiana per ESPN has the 106th strength of schedule in the country. And Ohio State, of course, is a top 5, top 3 team in terms of rankings, in terms of metrics, all this sort of thing. So them losing shouldn't make anybody freak out or push them all the way out. The other thing too that I think will help a little bit is that when you talk about these top contenders, there's so few that will only have one loss, that are only 11-1 or maybe 12-1. With the SEC, Texas is the only team left at this point that only has one loss. Now we can have another discussion about the fact that Texas is kind of able to skate by with just its record, even though their resume also isn't all that good. But that's reality. And so I think that if Indiana is competitive, I'm looking at the teams, right? I don't think that there are 12 teams that should clearly move ahead of Indiana, just to use the rankings that we have right now. Obviously, Oregon, Ohio State. I think that for better or worse, Penn State is going to stay ahead of them if they do lose this game. And then you start getting down the board, right? Notre Dame, obviously, the committee seems to love, so you're probably moving behind them. But then you're in the Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee range. I don't think there's anything crazy definitive about those teams. I don't think that Tennessee is giving you a whole lot more than Indiana necessarily. Now, the most interesting part, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is Tennessee is the team that's kind of looking up at but we beat Bama. But isn't that, we beat Bama? Isn't that enough? Does nothing else matter because we beat Bama? Isn't that how it should be? And it's just not. It's not Saban anymore, man. You're not going to get that kind of credit anymore. You're just not. And you shouldn't for beating an Alabama team that right now is ranked number 7. So a good team. But nobody's sitting here saying, oh, well, a team beat Ole Miss, and therefore we need to throw out every other thing we're looking at. LSU beat Ole Miss, and therefore we need to make sure that they're at least, nobody's saying that. And Ole Miss is rated about the same as Alabama at this point. So I think Indiana will be okay at 11-1, but you just don't know with these things, man.
I know when you were doing your analysis of the rankings on CBSSports.com, you pointed out this kind of predicament that Tennessee is in, because for those who aren't, aware of it, being ranked 11 doesn't mean you're in. It just means that you have a chance. And with two of the conference champions outside of it that would have to be included, they would be bumped out in favor of Boise, who's one spot behind them in the eventual Big 12 champ in this particular set of rankings. And the problem is they don't have very strong games coming up. They don't have a real opportunity to demonstrate, that they should be part of the conversation anymore. I mean, Vanderbilt, thankfully, is not the complete Vanderbilt team of old. They are a middle pack, solid, SEC team, which again for them is a triumph. UTEP is not going to move the needle at all. So for once, the SEC's decision to sometimes schedule these late non-conference games may come back to haunt them in lieu of a ninth conference game. Imagine if it had been a ninth conference game. Just imagine that. But it's interesting. I don't know what their position is. Does Tennessee have to hope for a little bit of chaos ahead of them with the other two-loss SEC teams plus Texas?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. I think that they are, out of the two loss teams, the one who firmly does not control their destiny. Because if Texas A&M beats Texas, who's ranked number 3 right now, they're in. Like I just think that they're in. If Texas beats Texas A&M, they're in. If Alabama finishes out, I think that they're high enough that they're in. I think, Ole Miss is such an interesting one. I don't feel like they should get as much credit as they do, but like Georgia also puts a little bit of a floor on them. Like they're going to be ahead of Georgia with the way that they beat them. So losing to LSU and Kentucky doesn't count against you the same way when you beat Georgia by 3 scores. And then like Georgia's obviously such an interesting case because they have 3 wins that are as good as anybody in the entire country and 2 that probably are the best wins in the entire country. And then they also have lost 2 of these games too. But I do think that that is enough for them to be in with how many hard games that they've had to play. So I think that Tennessee is this odd team out because they have the Bama win, but they have a terrible loss to Arkansas. And the rest of their resume is just not very good. If their resume outside of those 2 games looked just like from a dominance perspective, more like Notre Dame or Texas, I think they'd have a better case. But like you're playing close games against teams that are not very good. And again, like this offense, especially this passing offense, has just not been in gear since SEC play started. They just have not showed a whole lot of anything. Now, the good news is Texas plays Texas A&M. Now, that one probably isn't going to help you, but it's there. And then on top of that, Ole Miss plays Mississippi State, the Egg Bowl. Alabama plays Auburn. Like, Hugh Freeze was hired for this game. This is the game he was hired for. They paid him millions and millions of dollars to pray that he can win this single game. So, like, I don't think it's off the table that one of these teams loses a dumb one. I mean, heck, Georgia Tech beat Miami. Like, I don't think they're going to beat Georgia, but like, I don't know. I think that we've said it. Like, I don't think that this Georgia team is especially like unbeatable at this point. So like, I think that there's definitely a pathway for chaos to happen in front of them. But the other piece of this too is they have to avoid that chaos being Vanderbilt beating them.
I was about to say, we're now setting it up where it's going to be Tennessee losing to Vanderbilt. Oh my goodness. That would just be, it's interesting because you brought up Ole Miss. And one thing I also wanted to talk about, because we've had this conversation on and off over the past, all this run up into the 12-team playoff, as well as, others have discussed it. And Lane Kiffin brought it into the open, at least that the coaches have also talked about it, that some coaches maybe don't want to play, at least in the SEC championship game due to the playoff implications. And I mean, I'll just selectively quote from what he said, which I thought was a good quote. Now, I've talked to other coaches. They don't want to be in it. The reward to get a bye in the CFP versus the risk of getting knocked out completely, that's a pretty big risk. Now, some coaches have come out and pushed back against that. But at the same time, I mean, I'll give Glenn is known to occasionally just say things that they're probably saying quietly to each other and just dropping it in the presser. I would be shocked if this hasn't been a conversation. Like, again, Big 12, ACC, no, they're in like, you got to win it at this stage, unless you're Miami at this point. Literally no other team in those conferences has any, the way it's finishing now, would have any shot without having that opportunity to play a title game. But what do you think? Do you think that's something that we'll see more movement to?
I think that my response to that would be, if you are trying to game theory how you can play less competition so that you can help yourself, then you're a loser. Like, I just think you're a loser. Like, I get it. I get how much more difficult it is to have to play for a championship, but like, oh, cool. We get to be the 7 seed in the playoff instead of like, shut up, dude. Like, come on. Come on, that's so dumb to me. That's so silly to me. The idea of like trying to risk your place playing for a conference championship so that maybe you can like position yourself differently in the college football playoff. Like, come on, man. Be serious with this. The reality is that the conference championship games make the conferences a lot of money, first of all, so they're not going away. And I think that there's an understanding from the people in these conferences and the committee that, hey, you know what, like creating an incentive to miss this game is a bad deal. Like, it's a bad deal. Now, at the same time, I think that people are vastly underestimating the idea of getting a first round bye in the college football playoff and how much that's going to help. Because, for example, let's take a team like Tennessee. Let's say that they finish 9 or 10, right? Or like then they're having to go on the road. We've talked about it. Some of these teams are going to have to play in State College or South Bend in the middle of winter. And you also then will have to like play an extra game in the lead up to the college football playoff. So winning a conference championship, getting a bye, getting better matchups for yourself is a way better situation than losing. I mean, we just saw it right now. Ohio State just lost their starting center heading into their game against Indiana. They're down now 2 of their 3 top offensive linemen on the team because Josh Simmons, their left tackle, went out earlier in the year. And so that's going to impact not just this game, but every game from here on out. And the more games that you play, especially against top 10 opponents in the college football playoff 1 week after another, the more injuries are going to stack up. So, no, to me, this is ridiculous. Like, if you're sitting here being like, how can we game theory our way out of playing for a championship that would get us a bye? Then like, that's just loser talk to me. I do not, I don't care for that. Now, I will say too, the one sort of counter is like, with this 16 to 18 team conferences, I mean, there's really no true logic to even deciding who's going to be in these games. Like, there are going to be teams that quote unquote deserve to play for conference championships that won't. And there are going to be teams that quote unquote don't deserve to play for conference championships that do. And that's something that I think that these conferences have to get figured out. They have to figure out a more logical way to decide who's going to be playing in these games than sitting here calculating tiebreakers on Monday night so that you can send out your Tuesday press release saying, actually, Oregon is in.
I love like, that one, by the way. We didn't even touch on that it took it took the Big Ten was so, I think, distracted by having 4 teams in the top 5 spots that they forgot to actually say, oh yeah, by the way, Oregon's in our title game.
Well, and they actually told us, so we actually we heard from the Big Ten office, like, hey, hold off for the moment. Don't say that they're in, is it? Because some people like said, oh, well, based on tiebreaker math, like they're in. We got told by some sources, like, hey, just wait a second. And it turns out that actually they just needed to triple check their math and it was correct. And,
it was really funny, by the way. Wikipedia had them locked in. So whoever, I love those editors. They have obsession, and I say this respectfully, but they will look through stuff at a level that perhaps even the conference champions, probably the conference leaders didn't. And I love it because I went on there. I'm like, oh, they're a lock already? Why haven't they announced that in the Big Ten? And then the next day, the Big Ten announced it.
It's so crazy.
Oh my goodness.
And like, this is just like, and this is not a Big Ten conversation. This is something that conferences will be dealing with every single year heading forward as we go into 16, 17, 18 plus team conferences. It's just going to make the math impossibly hard and make things way more difficult.
You know, it is fascinating because it does make me think of some college football leagues, actually not in the United States, only because some of them, like their conferences got so big that they do have semifinals
Sure.
just for the conference. And then those champions go on into the playoff. Of course, their playoffs aren't usually quite that big, but like in Canada, they have 4 conferences. So it's actually really simple. They have a semifinal in their own conference title game, and then the 4 teams play in a semifinal in that. But I don't think we're going to be having conference semifinals. Although at the rate they're going, maybe that's the only way to resolve it if they keep running into this and insist on having only 8 conference games. When we get back from the break, we're going to take a look at some of these big games coming up here on Week 13 on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so there is a good slate of games coming up this week. We'll talk about some of them in depth, and we'll probably lightly talk about others. We've obviously already had a little bit of conversation about that big one in Columbus with Indiana undefeated, 10-0, going into play the Buckeyes, number 2. As we mentioned, this right now, the Buckeyes are favored by I think 13.5. So they're favored by, or I think it's gone down to 12 something. But regardless, they're favored by 2 scores. Whoever wins that game is going to be pretty much a lock for Indianapolis, I imagine. And I don't even know if the Big Ten would have to confirm that. I think that'll be pretty much finalized at this point. If they win the regular season finale, I'm pretty sure Indiana would have a good shot against Purdue. Michigan, I'm not going to count them out. I'm just not. I think you're going to jinx it if we all assume that's going to happen. I hope against hope that Ryan Day and company are good. They're going to be so laser focused on taking revenge that I'm pretty sure they're not. But I'm very curious to see how some of these things match up with the Will Howard versus that pass defense of Indiana. And we saw how Michigan, again, for all the flaws of Michigan, they still have some incredible talent on that defense. And we saw that gave Indiana some trouble in their game. Ohio State, I don't know if it has quite the talent level of individuals that they have on that Michigan defense, but they're still pretty dang good. And how can Indiana do against a team that is just across the board stacked as well as they are? I mean, we've talked about some of those injuries that Ohio State's saying, but we've also said in our previous episode that they're also built so well that they could very well be, they're supposed to be able to last through a lot of these injuries. How do you see this game shaping up?
This is such an interesting matchup, and I'm actually going to pull us over to collegefootballinsiders.com where they have their projection. And they have Indiana with a 40% win probability, which is very much like in the conversation. I think that there's this assumption that Ohio State is just going to bowl over Indiana, and Indiana is going to be completely helpless and have no shot. But here's one thing I want people to understand is that Indiana has some legitimate advantages in this game. One, they have the better quarterback to me. Like, Curtis Rourke is really good. Now, Will Howard is awesome. Like, he's played really well this year. But Curtis Rourke is playing as well right now as any quarterback in all of college football. And while he doesn't have a Jeremiah Smith out there necessarily, he does have some good pass catchers to make things happen. You look at some of the numbers that Curtis Rourke has put up: 2,400 yards, 21 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and 88.1 QBR. Like, he has been really, really good. And actually, in conference play specifically, Curtis Rourke has a 179 passer rating. So, like, he's not afraid, right? Like, he's not afraid in these big moments. I think that that's going to be a legitimate impact on this game. The other thing, too, is that when you look at Indiana versus Ohio State, I think you have to look really deeply at this trench play, because Indiana has an experienced offensive line. It was one of the things that actually Tom Allen left behind. I think that Indiana only had to bring in one new starter on the offensive line, and they've been coached up and they've played really well. They completely stuffed Nebraska in a locker, and we saw that Nebraska was able to cause a lot of issues for Ohio State in that game. On the other side, Ohio State, again, is going to be playing without 2 of their 3 best offensive linemen. Josh Simmons went out for the year earlier this season. Seth McLaughlin just went out yesterday with a torn Achilles, reportedly. So they're going to kind of need Donovan Jackson to be like one of the best players in the country to be able to keep up on the defense, on the offensive line rather, and defensively. I mean, so much of the conversation about Ohio State's defense has been about how relatively underwhelming the pass rush has been. And so I do think that overall, like, I don't know, it's just a tough situation, I think, when you look at the trenches right now for Ohio State. So, uh, like, Ohio State has some aspects of their team, of course, like the receiver play is just off the charts. When their run game gets going, it's really, really good. And I also think that there are better ways for their defensive playmakers to be deployed. I think that they probably win this game. But like I think dismissing the idea outright that Indiana can compete in this game, I think is short-sighted. And I think that I don't think that it gives enough respect to what they've accomplished this season.
What should viewers be looking for early on to get a hint that Indiana might actually have a shot here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's two things that I'd like to see. I'd like to see some early indicators of Curtis Rourke handling the pressure well. I think that that would be a big thing, just moving well in the pocket, stepping up, finding open receivers, and also receivers consistently creating some space against some really good Ohio State defensive backs that have had some lapses this year. And I think the other thing too is like if I'm Indiana, I am challenging that left side of the offensive line over and over and over again. I'm bringing pressure almost every single play from the left side and the center and forcing them to communicate. That's going to be the biggest thing.
Mm.
Look, there is not an Abdul Carter in this game for Indiana. Of course, they've got some good pass rushers, nothing like that. When Abdul Carter was lined up one-on-one against Donovan Jackson at left tackle, and Donovan Jackson might move back to left guard, it's a little bit up in the air. But when he was lined up one-on-one, like he destroyed those matchups. And I think that the way that you try to do that is like they are without their leader of communication in their center, Seth McLaughlin. So you want to come from different angles. You want to confuse them with protections. If they're able to get some pressure early on Will Howard, I think that that's how you win this game. Is you want to get 1 or 2 sacks early, make the offensive line question themselves, make Will Howard question himself. So it's really, I mean, it is going to come down to prove to me, Indiana, that your lines can be stress tested.
How would you compare Rourke against Dylan Gabriel? I mean, do you think that, and again, part of the thing is too, Dylan Gabriel also probably had a lot more talent he was throwing to. And that's something you pointed out with Ken, those receivers for Indiana create that space. But do you think there's enough talent there to pick those holes on Ohio State?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that Rourke is a better pocket passer, I'd say. He's able to go to more spots on the field than I think that Dylan Gabriel is uh, from the pocket. Now, the thing that Gabriel brings to the table that really is special is one, he is a great deep ball passer, and two, he also gives you a little bit more movement, right? Like he gives you more scrambling ability. With Rourke, obviously he can move, but he's not a quarterback with a true running component, I think that you'd say. So I mean, again, it's going to come down more to pocket manipulation to him than it is escaping pressure. That's not necessarily the kind of game that he wants to play. Now, I think the other piece too is that like when you talk about Rourke, I mean, he has been so strong with the ball, so accurate. I think that he has a lot of zip on his passes. And I think that overall, like you want to try to get there before Ohio State can get to you is going to be such a big part of it. I think that the one other piece too that you have to keep an eye on as well is when you look at Oregon. Oregon rushed for 155 yards and 2 touchdowns in their game. So you need to make sure that you have some sort of rushing component to your offense that's able to create some opportunities against the Ohio State defense. And now Ohio State is really good against the run. Like they obviously are so big and strong up front. The thing that Indiana has that's some credit is like they have multiple guys at running back that they use. That they have 2 guys that are over 100 carries and over 500 yards and each have 9 touchdowns. So like that's the hope I think for you too, is that like you're able to just battering ram them just a little bit and create some space for your offense to work. But that's probably going to be the most difficult aspect of this game, is trying to avoid becoming one-dimensional as an offense.
Shifting over to, because I think I was trying to sort of identify games that can touch on the real contenders to try and make into the playoff. Obviously, one of them involves a current top 10 team, and the other is a G5 challenger, and it's the one we're obviously going to talk about. Army facing Notre Dame in the Shamrock Series. They're playing at Yankee Stadium because, of course, it's the 100th anniversary plus a month of the famous Grantland Rice under a blue-gray sky. Blah 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 blah. Some of you have read it. I recommend it. That was back in the day when poets could also be sports writers. But it's a real interesting matchup because Army's schedule, to put it charitably, is we were talking about Indiana. Army's somehow is not even close to Indiana's schedule in terms of strength of schedule, but they have been pretty good. And their style of play has obviously always been unique to what they can do with the academies. So it'll be curious to see what that Notre Dame run defense can do against Army. But they do pass a little bit, and they have a very interesting quarterback there who is, I believe, is back to full strength. And whether or not the Irish can similarly dominate on the ground as they did against Navy. Although Navy, again, for those who didn't see that game, Navy was literally just falling apart. Like Army just had to almost sit back and watch Navy implode in MetLife Stadium. But all of that said, there's going to be a lot of hype for this game. It's such a fascinating one. Although I do fear, is this one that Army really realistically has a shot to win? Of course, I say that knowing that NIU has managed to pull it off. But realistically at this point, this Notre Dame we're seeing now seems different than that one. Do we think that there is any shot that the Cadets have against pulling this upset?
So it's not an ideal matchup, I don't think, if you're Army. And look, we want to go back to our friend Stats of War over with his College Football Insider's projection. Army has a 13% win probability heading into this matchup. I do think, I've talked to Bill Connolly about it before. Like, service academies aren't going to be the greatest, like they're not going to fit the boxes quite as well in terms of like projections, because like they're not throwing the ball, for example, and they're just trying to win games different ways. But certainly, I think it's not the most ideal situation. I think that the biggest point of optimism, I guess if you could call it that, is that you look at Notre Dame's stat profile and they're like really, really good across the board and basically everything right now. Where they're probably worst, well, the two places are probably worst. One is drop back passing, which I don't think is going to be a huge factor in this game, but it's defensively against the run. They're actually number one against the pass in drop back defensive success rate, but they're 47th against the run. I'm sure that the Northern Illinois game probably had a little something to do with it. So I do think that Army's going to be able to score. I do think that they're going to be able to hold on to the ball and make this game really, really ugly. The issue is I think that Notre Dame also will be able to do it right back. I think that they're going to be able to hang on to the ball. We've talked about Riley Leonard. Like, he is, to me, the exact type of quarterback that this Notre Dame offense needs, because he just makes plays with the ball in his hands. And so I do think that, generally speaking, Notre Dame's going to be able to hang on and win. I do think it's going to be closer than people expect. I do expect Army to be able to move the ball a little bit. But again, closer than people expect is probably like 31-21. Like, I do think that Notre Dame wins.
Yeah, I fully expect Army to try and slow this game down as much as possible, which would be in their interest. Like, we talked about that, 13-minute drive they had against North Texas. That'll be fascinating. Yeah. If they manage to pull that stuff on Notre Dame, that would be absolutely interesting. And it would be a miserable, for modern football standards for some folks, but it would be absolutely fascinating. It would be a throwback to 100 years ago.
And I will mention real quick too, is that with Army defensively is a lot better than Navy is. Like, they're not amazing at it, but like when you look at success rate, Navy is 84th in success rate and 96th in rushing defensive success rate. Army's in the 50s. Like, so they are notably better in that aspect. So I don't expect a 51-14 like we saw against Navy, like you said, where Navy kind of just fell apart on itself. And I also just watching the two teams even before the Notre Dame game, I felt like Army was a little bit more of a complete team heading into this matchup, or just across the season than Navy has been. Navy's been obviously so good offensively, but I don't think that they were quite as balanced, and I don't think they were quite as consistent. Army has been a really consistent team behind Bryson Daly. So I don't think it's going to look like 51-14, but I do think that that Notre Dame's going to be able to pull away.
All I keep thinking of, I don't know if you saw it. This is some in Notre Dame hockey, I guess, is playing a game in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And have you seen this? They can't. They're telling all their fans, please don't wear green. Please don't wear shamrocks. Please don't say Fighting Irish. And I'm like, you guys, did anyone bother to pull out a history book before you decided to book this game? I mean, it would have been hilarious if they played Syracuse. So it's like them against the Orange. Like, I can't even fathom that. But I don't want to get into like what's going on in the troubles. But I mean, just it's just hilarious. They're literally telling their fans not to wear anything that says anything the color green, anything that says Fighting Irish, anything that says Irish, anything with shamrocks, anything with the Ireland flag and the leprechaun. And like, did anyone like, my goodness, that's still one of my favorite things ever. Like, I can't just, I'm sure there are other teams that if you put them in another country, it would create awkward situations, but that is a king right there. Sorry, I just had to bring that up since we're talking about Notre Dame.
Why would you play a game in Belfast if you're Notre Dame? Like, if
I don't think anyone thought that through. Well, it's Ireland. I mean, yes, but there's complications with this. It's a very rich culture, lots of things going on.
Well, and like, this is America's and the world's arguably most high-profile Catholic university. Like, this is like the Catholic place. And you're going to Northern Ireland? That's anyway,
hey, as long as they didn't pick a Protestant school opponent, that I think was their wisest move.
Who are they playing?
I have no idea who they're playing. I'm actually really curious. Like, are they playing like the Northern Ireland national team?
They're playing Presbyterian.
Oh my god! Some Anglican school. That would be the perfect thing.
Oh no, that would be big trouble. That would be.
Oh my goodness!
Oh, they're playing Harvard. Wait, they're. They're playing actually. Harvard, and so this is like this is actually hilarious too. So this is like a tournament, and so the first round they're playing Harvard, and then the second round they play the winner of Merrimack and Boston University. Okay, I think
Boston U and probably because Boston U is pretty good. They play for the Beanpot, don't they? And I'm trying to think. Like Harvard's generally historically good at hockey, so maybe they'll be the favorites. But I don't know. What a fascinating.
Okay, Merrimack is a Catholic school. It's Augustinian. Okay. So, but yeah, if I don't know, is there a big Anglican college in the U.S. or like big of history?
I don't know. I have to look up. I have to go and look back. So many of them like lose their connection. Like my alma mater, USC, was technically founded by Methodists at one point, which is why USC and Northwestern, historically, their old names were Fighting Methodists before they went in their own directions with their names and kind of eventually be affiliated. USC was kind of weird. USC, remember, LA had like, I'm not even joking, 20,000 people when USC was founded. So like its founders were a Catholic, a Methodist minister, and a Jew, and the Methodist minister ran the school. So that's why they ended up doing that way. But anywho, we're getting a little far afield.
Well, just real quick. So there are a handful of Episcopalian schools in the U.S., but none of them are Bard College, Kenyon University, Trinity in Connecticut, Sewanee, like. Now, okay. Actually, this is a fun fact. Until 1938, and this takes us back to the college football playoff. Until 1938, Boise State was an Episcopalian school, and then
they were like a junior college.
I have no idea. I
know Boise State used to be a junior college historically. That's what they would get razzed by that all the time by some of their other their rivals. My goodness. Well, kind of steering. I think College William and Mary started as one. That one would make sense. I think they were, because they were one of the, and I wouldn't be shocked if, well, I don't know if Rutgers was, but certainly College William and Mary, because historically they were I mean, well, they're named after British royalty. Anywho, coming back over to this. So the Big 12 has a couple of games I thought we should discuss. They have obviously the BYU is going to go play Arizona State. Arizona State is favored by a little bit. The winner's going to put themselves in a great position for the Big 12 title race. You can't say lock it because at this point, there's so many variables there. The Sun Devils have been such a team on the rise right now. Their success seems to be tied to the success of Sam Levitt, who's been a surprising, improvement as a quarterback right now. They have Jordan Tyson as a good receiver to throw to. Obviously, Cameron Scatabo has been a real hit as a running back. And then the other game, I'm just going to throw it out there and we can discuss in whatever order. Colorado, in the driver's seat. They're going to Kansas. Kansas apparently is in a totally different mode right now. The Jayhawks finally turned on, or at the very least, we can certainly say Jalen Daniels is finally showing up to play the way he was supposed to play. Colorado's only favored by 2 in Arrowhead Stadium, a little over 2. So again, this is very Big 12. Both games are very close. How do you see these panning out?
Yeah, I think that there is absolutely the possibility that both of these end in upsets. Like, I think that these are 4 teams right now that are playing very good football. Kansas, I mean, they started 1-5, but like all of their losses were by like 6 points or fewer, and they just threw a ton of interceptions in those games. They figured that out. They've settled down. Over their past 3 games, they've beaten undefeated Iowa State. They've beaten undefeated BYU. They only lost to Kansas State by 2 points, 29-27 on the road. And now they head into this matchup against Colorado. And I think this will be as good a defensive challenge as Colorado's faced this year. I mean, when you look at Kansas, their greatest strength is probably in the secondary with Kobe Bryant and Mello Dotson, both of whom were preseason All Big 12 selections. And I think the other piece too, and where this is going to get most interesting is like, this has to be an offensive misdirection game if you are Kansas, because Colorado is really, really good up front. You want their defense moving side to side, not straight up and down, because that's where they're going to beat you, is they're going to attack your gaps. I think that I still lean Colorado, but like, I mean, we've seen it over the past 3 weeks that Kansas is capable of beating good teams. This Arizona State game against BYU is so fascinating. One, I do think this is going to be a bounce back spot just a little bit for BYU. I mean, they had kind of been playing with fire for a little bit, and now I think this will be kind of a clarifying moment for them, I guess you could say. But this is a BYU team that just does a good job of controlling games, of taking advantage of opportunities, of taking advantage of field position. When you look at Arizona State, they're a poor field position team. BYU is really good at it. And I think that it's also going to just be, hey, can you win on early downs enough? Can you put yourself in a position to be in second and third and short instead of having to travel as far as they had to during times against Kansas? So I think that both favorites survive, but both could easily lose, and it would not surprise me. And I know that that's the most boring analysis possible.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating too. I want to say, I at first it isn't going to be too hot in Arizona. That was what I was thinking. It's good because it was like it's a 1:30 local kickoff, which I'm like, oh my goodness, but it is late in the season, so it's actually going to be probably a nice, pleasant 78 degree day is going to be the high, so it shouldn't be too bad. A little warmer than comfortable for football, but still good enough. Not like playing in a noon game like they would ever do that in the early season in Tempe, but. I'm curious to see how that environment's going to be. With Colorado, I think Colorado being on the road is also fascinating too, because Boulder, from all accounts, is absolutely going wild right now. Like they are finally, but they're going to Arrowhead. So I'm really curious to see how the breakdown is going to be of that fan base. Again, for those who don't remember, Kansas is one of the teams that is totally rebuilding their stadium. So instead of doing a temporary stadium on the lake like Northwestern did, or just playing through it like Army, because that's what they are, they're tough. They are playing most of their games, all their games in the 2 Kansas cities, and all their conference games were already scheduled here for Arrowhead Stadium where the Kansas City Chiefs play. But very curious to see how that one's going to go. These two are going to be absolute entertainment. So thank you, Big 12, for taking over all of the Pac-12 chaos that you decided to bear it on your shoulders with these teams. ACC doesn't have a whole lot of interesting matchups, but I figure we should talk about the SMU game only because Miami is Miami even playing this week? I can't remember. I don't know if they have a good one.
They are. They were off last week.
Clemson has the Citadel, so we're not even going to talk about that. But SMU is playing at Virginia, the most average team. They're 5-5 and 3-3 in conference. But SMU at this point, I mean, they need to put. Do you think they need to worry about style points at all, or just keep winning and get that conference title game? And there is no other real issue here. Who cares how you win? Just get through.
Yeah, you just got to win. I mean, their pathway in is going to be through the conference championship games. I don't think that they're going to get as much credit as they deserve for what they've done this year. And so overall, I just think that just win. Just win. Don't worry about all the other chaos. I think, again, when you just look ahead of them, I don't see them being ranked ahead of Tennessee. I don't see them being ranked ahead of whoever else. I think that, again, the most positive thing that probably happened for SMU is moving ahead of BYU, because it means that you are higher priority to make sure that you get one of those buys if you do beat Miami later in the year. So I don't think you have to show anything. You just have to win.
Now, the SEC has 3 games. I'm not saying we're going to discuss each one in depth, but Alabama, because we have all the 2-loss teams to worry about. Alabama's playing Oklahoma, so they're playing a team with at least theoretically a pulse. Texas A&M,
there's no pulse there.
Don't and I was going to say, Texas A&M is the most seems to have the biggest challenge ahead of them because they're only favored by under 3 points heading to Auburn. And it is November for A&M. That's what I told my friend. I'm like, why is this line so small? And then they said, like, check the calendar, for Texas A&M's history. And I'm like, that's getting a little mean at this point. The trap game angle I could believe. And then I'm just going to also throw out, we do have Ole Miss playing at Florida, and Florida has moments. And again, there's that potential in the swamp for another bit of chaos being thrown in there. What do you make of this slate? Is there a game that particularly sticks out for you?
Yeah, for me, it's the Ole Miss game against Florida. Because like I've mentioned, I mean, outside of the Georgia game, and, again, they got the South Carolina game, but South Carolina was not playing this well when they played Ole Miss early in the season. But like outside of that, Ole Miss's resume is pretty inconsistent. That LSU loss continues to look worse and worse. That Kentucky loss looked terrible at the time and is somehow still getting worse.
Yeah.
So it's like you beat Georgia, you blasted Arkansas, and I don't know if you did anything else that's all that useful for us. And so now they go on the road to Florida. They're playing in the swamp, and I do think that that overall, I don't know. It's just, I feel like this Florida team is playing really hard right now. I think that they have some pieces on offense that are tough to match up with. The irony is that, who used to play for Florida last year was Princely Umanmielen, who is now potentially the best pass rusher for Ole Miss. But I think that Ole Miss is going to manage to win this game, but I think Florida has the potential to really make things messy.
They do. I know that they do have trouble with the play action, and that's something that Ole Miss is probably going to be taking advantage of them. But we'll see if they can control some big plays that might come out of that. I'll just say one other thing. We're not going to really discuss these games, but Boise State, just because I'm always nervous. Again, they beat San Jose State last week, but that score got a lot bigger because there was a late pick 6 in that game. They're favored by a lot. They're going up to Wyoming. I doubt the altitude's going to affect the Broncos that much because that's they've played them for many, many years. So that's one of the games out there, but we have to mention it, I feel, because they do have to win out in order to get into that playoff spot. And UNLV, newly minted at number 24, they actually get San Jose State. They're going to be playing there this week. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that game. Neither one of those teams has a chance of getting in the playoff, but they could absolutely affect Boise State's position in all of this, especially now that they are, at least for now, the 4 seed. So I thought I'd just throw that's actually a Friday game, by the way. So that'll be a chance for people to watch. One thing I found out, I did not realize the guy who invented the wave is actually a San Jose State fan because he was on the TV when they were playing Boise State.
I think I did see that report too, that you, man, there's so many things that come out of the Bay Area that you're just like, what? what happened? Like Oakland, San Francisco. Now, not as often from San Jose, I will say that, but you just look up and it's like, oh yeah, this was invented in, the South Bay, and you're just like, what?
Yeah, the guy's fascinating. I looked him up. Crazy George with the K, crazy. Like, again, just fascinating stuff. If you can have that kind of life and you enjoy it, go for it. His whole bio is like, kind of like, this guy found like the perfect way to like enjoy life. Like, man, we all hope we find something we enjoy stuff as like that. But I think that's a good spot to wrap this up. And we enjoy talking to you. That's something we enjoy talking about here. And we want to thank you for joining us. We want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. Blue Sky as well. I'm Bobak Kyrie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening, everyone.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.